On a quiet morning in Westbridge Park, a white police officer snatched the cane from a blind black woman and shattered it, never realizing that her son, a police captain, would be the one to decide his fate. How will justice be served? Will the system protect one of its own? Or will the truth finally prevail? Stay with us to find out. And don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Evelyn Carter had always been a woman of resilience. At 72 years old, she had long adjusted to life without sight. Blindness never defined her. It merely shaped the way she navigated the world. Each morning, she left her modest home in Westbridge, a quiet town nestled along the East Coast, and made her way to Westbridge Park, a place that had become her sanctuary. The rhythmic tapping of her white cane against the pavement was as much a part of the park's morning symphony as the chirping birds and rustling leaves. She knew every bend in the path, every subtle shift in the air that marked the seasons. It was her space, her freedom. Yet, beneath the serene facade of Westbridge Park, tension brewed. Recent incidents between the police and the black community had sparked unease. Local discussions grew heated. News reports were filled with protests and calls for justice. And though Evelyn preferred to stay away from political conflicts, she wasn't blind to the reality surrounding her. That morning, as she reached her favorite bench beneath an old oak tree, a voice interrupted her peace. "Mom, you go out here alone?" The voice was gruff, unfamiliar. Evelyn turned her head slightly, gripping her cane. "I am. I've walked this park for years." A pause. Then the man chuckled, low and condescending. "Brave of you?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I don't see it as bravery, just independence." "Well," the voice continued, stepping closer, "not everyone around here is as kind as me." Evelyn straightened her shoulders. Something about his tone made the morning air feel colder. She had heard that kind of warning before, and it never led to anything good. Evelyn Carter had always believed that the park was a place of peace, a space where she could exist freely without being questioned. But something about the encounter with the officer that morning unsettled her. The way he spoke, the patronizing tone, it wasn't just a passing comment. It was a warning. She brushed it off, refusing to let fear dictate her life. Yet deep down she knew, men like him never truly left things alone. The next morning, Evelyn followed her usual route, cane tapping steadily along the pavement. The autumn air was crisp, the scent of fallen leaves mingling with the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby vendor's cart. She focused on the familiar sensations, pushing away yesterday's discomfort. But as she neared the old oak tree, her instincts flared. Heavy footsteps crunched against the gravel behind her. Deliberate, slow. Then, the same voice from yesterday rang out. "Well, if it isn't the park's most fearless visitor." Evelyn stopped, her grip on her cane tightening. She turned her head slightly toward the voice. "Good morning again, officer." "Brent Wilson," he replied, stepping closer. Evelyn didn't need sight to recognize the arrogance in his tone. She had encountered men like him before, men who used authority as a weapon, not a duty. "I see you're out here alone again," Wilson continued, circling around her like a predator, sizing up its prey. "I always am," Evelyn said evenly. "I don't need company to enjoy my morning." Wilson scoffed. "No family to keep an eye on you? No one to make sure you don't wander into trouble?" "I manage just fine," she replied, her patience wearing thin. Wilson suddenly stepped in front of her, his boots scuffing against the pavement. "You think you got it all figured out, huh?" Evelyn straightened her posture. "I've learned to rely on myself. I suggest you focus on your job instead of questioning how I live my life." Wilson chuckled. but the amusement in his voice was laced with something darker. "Lady, you got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't stop bad things from happening." A cold shiver ran down Evelyn's spine. "Are you trying to make a point, Officer Wilson? Or are you just enjoying hearing yourself talk?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Wilson's demeanor shifted. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Before she could respond, he did something that made time slow. In one swift motion, he yanked the cane from her hands. Evelyn gasped, instinctively reaching for the object that had been her lifeline for years. "Give that back," she demanded. Wilson didn't answer. Instead, the sharp snap of the cane breaking in half echoed through the air. Evelyn froze. The sound was more than just the destruction of an object. It was the shattering of her autonomy, her dignity. She felt the shift in the crowd around them. People were watching, murmuring, but no one intervened. A jogger slowed down but quickly moved on. A mother clutched her child's hand, averting her gaze. Wilson tossed the broken pieces at Evelyn's feet. "Next time, don't mouth off to someone who's trying to keep you safe." Evelyn bent down shakily, her fingers brushing against the splintered wood. Humiliation burned hot in her chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by something stronger: anger. "You're nothing but a bully," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Wilson leaned in, his tone cold and mocking. "And you're just another blind old woman who doesn't know her place." From a distance, Marcus Reed, the coffee vendor, stood frozen behind his cart, phone in hand. He had captured everything. His heart pounded as he debated his next move. Wilson adjusted his belt, brushing off his uniform as if he had just finished an unpleasant chore. "Good luck out there, ma'am," he said, with a smirk, before turning on his heel and walking away. The murmurs of the crowd swirled around Evelyn, whispers of, "Did you see that? And she didn't deserve that," filling the air. Yet no one reached out to help her. Evelyn clutched the broken cane in her hands, her breath shallow. The park, her sanctuary, had just become the stage for her humiliation. From behind his cart, Marcus hesitated, his thumb hovering over the upload button. He knew this video was important, but he also knew, once it was out there was no turning back. Evelyn sat in her armchair, the broken pieces of her cane resting in her lap. Her fingers traced the jagged edges as if trying to piece them back together, but no amount of effort could undo what had happened. The humiliation, the sheer audacity of that officer, it all played in her mind like a cruel echo. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Mom." David's voice was filled with concern as he stepped inside. Evelyn straightened, composing herself. "I wasn't expecting you so late." David's sharp blue eyes immediately fell on the broken cane. His jaw tightened. "What happened?" Evelyn sighed, running a hand over her scarf. "A police officer took my cane and broke it. Right there, in front of everyone." David froze. "A cop did this?" His voice was dangerously low. "He said his name was Officer Brent Wilson," Evelyn said, her tone calm but steady. "And he made it clear he thought I didn't belong in the park." David's hands clenched into fists. "Did anyone step in?" "No," Evelyn admitted. "People saw, they whispered, but no one helped." David paced the living room, his anger barely restrained. He had spent his career trying to be the kind of officer who protected, who upheld justice. And now, his own mother had been targeted, not by a stranger, but by a man who wore the same uniform he did. "This isn't staying quiet," David said. "I'm reporting this." Evelyn looked up at her son. "I need you to be careful, David." He shook his head. "Number. He should have been careful." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Reed sat at his small apartment's kitchen table, staring at his phone screen. The video of Officer Wilson breaking Evelyn's cane played in an endless loop. His hands were clammy, his chest tight. He knew what would happen if he posted it. People would react. The police would be forced to respond. But there was also the risk. What if they came after him? What if he lost his business? His finger hovered over the upload button. And then, he pressed it. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire. Social media erupted in outrage. Justice for Evelyn and protect the vulnerable began trending. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the footage over and over. The image of Officer Wilson yanking the cane from an elderly blind woman and snapping it in two became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked police power. David arrived at the precinct to a storm. Whispers followed him as he walked through the hallways. Some officers avoided his gaze. Others glared openly. The tension was thick, suffocating. Captain Miller, a grizzled veteran with years in the force, called David into his office. The moment the door shut, he tossed a folder onto the desk. "You see what's happening?" Miller demanded. "I do," David said evenly. "Wilson's being put on leave," Miller admitted. "But you, Hollis, you need to tread carefully. You don't want to make enemies in your own department." David leaned forward. "An enemy is someone who hurts innocent people. If that makes me a problem, then so be it." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about Wilson anymore. The department's under fire. You really want to be at the center of this storm?" David's answer was simple. "I don't care about the storm. I care about justice." David Carter had been with the Westbridge Police Department for over a decade. He had seen good officers, bad officers, and those who simply looked the other way. But now, his own department was turning against him for demanding accountability. The morning after the video went viral, David walked into the precinct with his head held high. The weight of his badge had never felt heavier. Conversations halted as he passed, officers muttering under their breath. He caught snippets of their words. "Betraying one of our own. He's making us look bad. Should have kept it in-house." He ignored them. His destination was Captain Miller's office, where he knew the real battle would begin. The door was already open. Inside, Miller stood by the window, staring at his phone. "You see the news?" Miller asked without turning. "I did," David replied. Miller exhaled sharply and finally faced him. "Wilson's been placed on administrative leave. The department's reviewing the incident." "That's not enough," David said, his voice firm. "This wasn't just bad judgment. It was an abuse of power. He deliberately humiliated my mother." Miller narrowed his eyes. "You're too close to this, Carter." David stepped forward. "That's exactly why I won't back down. If it were anyone else, I'd still be standing here demanding justice." Miller rubbed his temples. "You're making enemies fast, son. There are officers who see you as a traitor right now." David's jaw tightened. "If doing the right thing makes me a traitor, then maybe we need fewer loyal officers and more honest ones." Miller sat down, folding his hands. "You've got witnesses, don't you?" David nodded. "I do. Marcus Reed, the coffee vendor, filmed everything, and I spoke to Officer Sarah Monroe. She has a history with Wilson. She's seen him abuse his power before." Miller sighed. "Monroe. She's been trying to call out corruption in this department for years, and look where it got her, stuck on desk duty." David didn't flinch. "Then, maybe it's time we finally listen to her." Miller was silent for a moment. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. "All right. Get me statements, if I'm going to take this up the chain. I need everything airtight." David didn't need to be told twice. That evening, He met Sarah Monroe at a quiet diner on the edge of town. She looked up as he slid into the booth across from her, her expression wary. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, I hear you're on a crusade." David smirked slightly. "You could say that. But I'm not doing this alone. I need your help." Sarah leaned back. "You sure about that? Speaking out against Wilson is one thing, but challenging the entire system, that's career suicide." David shook his head. "Wilson isn't the only problem. He's a symptom. If we don't fight back now, this department will keep protecting men like him." Sarah exhaled. "I've been where you are, Carter. I tried to report a senior officer for using excessive force. Know what happened? My reports disappeared. My partner was reassigned. I got put on paperwork duty." David met her gaze. "I know the risks. But if we don't do this, nothing changes." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. I'll testify, but you'd better be ready for the fallout." David nodded. "I am." The next morning, David submitted Sarah's statement alongside Marcus's video. The evidence was undeniable, but so were the consequences. As he approached his desk, he found a note taped to his locker. "Think about your career. Back off." And just like that, the real fight began. The pressure inside the Westbridge Police Department had reached a boiling point. Officers whispered in corners, exchanged glances, and some outright refused to acknowledge David Carter's presence. He had become a pariah among his own. But David didn't care. He was here for one reason: to make sure Officer Brent Wilson was held accountable. The internal affairs hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. The room was packed, not just with officers, but with community members who had seen the video and demanded justice. Evelyn Carter was there, seated in the front row, her posture poised, her chin lifted. She had refused to stay home. David stood near the back, arms crossed as he watched Brent Wilson saunter into the room. Wilson didn't look worried. If anything, he smirked, his confidence unshaken. He was still betting that the system would protect him. The IA investigator, Lisa Greer, cleared her throat and began. "Officer Wilson, you are here today due to allegations of misconduct regarding your treatment of Evelyn Carter on October 7th. You have seen the video. Do you deny your actions?" Wilson sat back in his chair, arms folded. "That video doesn't show the full story." David clenched his fists. "Of course." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Then tell us, Officer Wilson, what's the full story?" Wilson shrugged. "She was acting aggressively, refused to listen to commands. I had to step in." A murmur of disbelief spread through the room. Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Acting aggressively?" Lisa repeated, unimpressed. She turned to the evidence table and tapped the laptop in front of her. The screen behind her flickered to life, playing the video from Marcus Reed's phone. The room watched in silence as Wilson's actions played out. Him yanking the cane from Evelyn's hands, the snap as he broke it, the smirk on his face as he tossed the pieces at her feet. The video ended. Lisa turned back to Wilson. "That doesn't look like de-escalation to me, Officer Wilson." Wilson shifted in his seat, his smirk fading. "She was disrespectful. If I hadn't stepped in, who knows what could have happened." David stepped forward, his voice steady but cold. "What could have happened, Wilson? What was so dangerous about a blind, elderly woman walking in a public park?" Wilson glared at him. "You don't know what it's like out there, Carter. People like her, they push the limits. Someone's got to remind them who's in charge." The room exploded in gasps and murmurs. David felt his blood boil. "You mean, remind them of their place?" Wilson smirked again, but it was weaker this time. "Call it what you want." Lisa exhaled sharply. Enough. Officer Wilson, you have a documented history of misconduct, multiple complaints, excessive force, intimidation, abuse of authority. The only reason you've gotten away with it is because none of those cases had enough evidence. She gestured at the screen. Now, we do. Wilson's face paled slightly. Lisa turned to Captain Miller, who had remained silent until now. Captain, do you have anything to say before we proceed with a formal recommendation? Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at David briefly, then at the restless audience. When he finally spoke, his tone was grim. Officer Wilson, you're a liability. You don't uphold this barge. You disgrace it. Miller leaned forward. Effective immediately. You're terminated from the Westbridge Police Department. Silence. Then, the crowd erupted in applause. David exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. He looked toward his mother, who remained still. Only when she turned her head slightly in his direction did he see the faintest of smiles. But Wilson wasn't done. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. This is bullshit. You're throwing me under the bus for what? Some political stunt? His eyes burned with fury as he turned to David. You think this is over? You think I'm just gonna go quietly? David stepped up to him, his voice low and deadly calm. You already lost, Wilson. Walk away before you dig yourself deeper. For a moment, Wilson looked like he might swing. But then, he scoffed, shaking his head. You'll regret this, he muttered, before storming out of the room. David didn't move until the doors slammed shut behind him. The IA panel quickly moved forward, recommending formal charges be filed against Wilson for misconduct and abuse of power. The community had won this battle, but David knew the war for real police accountability had just begun. As he walked toward his mother, Evelyn reached for his hand. You did good, son, she murmured. David squeezed her fingers gently. So did you, Mom. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe. The evening air was crisp as David and Evelyn walked through Westbridge Park, just as they had many times before. But tonight, the weight of what had happened over the past few weeks felt lighter, if only slightly. Evelyn's new white cane, gifted to her by David, tapped confidently against the pavement. A small silver engraving near the handle read, Strength is not in what we see, but in what we stand for. As they reached the old oak tree, Evelyn paused, tilting her head slightly, as if listening to something unseen. It feels different today, she murmured. David glanced around, his hands in his jacket pockets. Maybe because this time, it's truly your space again, not his. Evelyn nodded, her grip on the cane tightening. It always was. They sat on the familiar bench, the same one Evelyn had been humiliated near weeks ago. Now, the park buzzed with life, joggers passing by, children laughing in the distance, the scent of autumn leaves lingering in the air. David turned to his mother. You thinking about what's next? Evelyn smiled softly. I won't be silent, if that's what you mean. People need to know they don't have to just take it. They can fight back. David smirked. Guess it runs in the family. Evelyn chuckled. Guess it does. As they sat in the glow of the park lights, neither spoke for a moment. Some fights left wounds that didn't heal overnight. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, justice had won. And in that moment, David knew. The battle wasn't over. But they had won this round. And that was enough. For now. The story of Evelyn Carter and her son, David, is more than just an account of injustice. It is a reminder of the power of courage, accountability, and resilience. In our daily lives, we may not face the exact same challenges, but the lessons remain relevant. One of the key takeaways is the importance of speaking up against injustice. Too often, people witness wrongdoing, but stay silent out of fear or complacency. The bystanders in the park hesitated, unsure if they should intervene. But one person, Marcus Reed, chose to act. His decision to record and share the truth sparked change. This teaches us that even small actions, reporting misconduct, standing up for someone, or simply refusing to tolerate discrimination, can make a difference. Another lesson is that systems only change when people challenge them. David Carter risked his career to hold a corrupt officer accountable. His story shows us that reform doesn't happen easily, but those who persist can push institutions toward real accountability. Ultimately, this story urges us to be aware, to act, and to support those who fight for justice. Change begins with individuals, but it takes a community to sustain it. Today's story is not just about a mother and son's courage. It's a reminder of how important it is to stand up against injustice, even when it means facing opposition and personal risk. If you were in David's shoes, going up against a system that protects the guilty, what would you do? Would you choose to speak out, no matter the challenges, to fight for justice, one? Or would you stay silent to protect yourself and avoid conflict too? Drop a 1 or 2 in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story.